Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 45. Not a lot of channel admin this week, other than to say that the competition, battleship design competition, hopefully we should have the first tranche of winners announced in next week's Drydock, so fingers crossed for that. So the two videos we're particularly taking questions from this week are how to build a navy, the planning, procurement, production and logistics video, and the guide to USS Salt Lake City. So as with the coastal defences video with how to build a navy, there's far too many sources to list in this section of the Drydock. So once again, if you want to know about particular item raised there, just let me know below. And that leaves us with a bit more time for questions. Good for us. Augusto Solari asks, why couldn't the Germans outbuild the Royal Navy, taking into account that on the eve of the First World War their economy was somewhat more dynamic than the British? Well, there's a few reasons for that, one of which is that some arguments and documents and books and such that present comparative economical figures are somewhat misleading, because whilst it's true that by 1914 the German economy was slightly larger than the British economy in terms of things like GDP and things like steel output, those books are missing the GDP and industrial output of this small thing called the British Empire, which contributed to the overall UK economy, well, the British imperial economy, I guess you could call it. And when you add that in, the imperial economy is about twice as large as the German economy. So there's a lot more involved in it than just purely the industrial output and GDP of the UK as an island. Secondly, there is the fact that although Britain had an empire to maintain, its army was nowhere near the size of the German army, because Germany was first and foremost a continental land power, and so with the amount of money they had available for defence, the British didn't have to funnel anywhere near as much into their army. They could make most of their defence spending naval, whereas the Germans had to maintain a far larger army because, well, as they feared, they were sandwiched between France and Russia, both of which were also continental land powers, both of which had very large armies, and so the amount of money that the German Navy was going to receive was always going to be less, unless the Germans wanted to spend truly economy-breaking levels of money on their defence, which they weren't going to. And thirdly, it's a very appropriate question for the How to Build a Navy video, because it also involves the logistics of industry. And as I've mentioned before in other videos, the fact is by the 1900s, 1910s, Britain had a vast shipbuilding industry. Germany had a large shipbuilding industry, but it was nowhere near the size of shipbuilding in the UK and the rest of the British Empire, for that matter. And on top of that, the specialist niche industries that are involved in producing warships were again far larger in Britain. So even if the Germans had chosen to spend enough money on defence that they could match British naval spending, even when we take into account the fact that Britain had a lot more money to spend in the first place thanks to its empire, but even if somehow the Germans matched that, and even if we assume that all other major constructions such as large merchant ships and liners is suspended, so every single yard capable of building a capital ship or armoured cruiser, etc., is taken over for warship production, the simple fact of the matter is German industry cannot produce enough armour plate, enough heavy guns, etc., to keep up with that kind of demand, whereas the British can. And as I said before in other videos, the simple fact of the matter is that even at the height of the arms race, when Britain was pumping out far more warships than Germany was, and still producing foreign warships for other powers, there were still British yards and warship industries going bust because there wasn't enough business. Britain's building capacity for warships was so stupidly in excess of practically everybody else's, as long as they had the money to pay for it, that no one would really surpass that kind of production capability until the United States in the Second World War. Connor McLernan asks, what do you believe happened to sink the Hood? I've heard there were conflicting theories as to how it happened. Well, yes, there were, and still are to a certain extent, many conflicting theories as to exactly how the Hood was destroyed. Now, as far as what I believe happened, well, I could go into it here, but I'm going to go into it in a lot more detail in probably 3-4 weeks' time when I do a follow-up to the Operation Rheinübung video about Bismarck's final voyage, which will be focused entirely on the theories surrounding Hood sinking. So I will save my answer for then. Kylar Stern asks, if you could design an ideal commerce raider for Germany in 1936 instead of building the Bismarck class, what would it look like? Surface ship, no U-boat. Well, if you are looking purely at tonnage sunk versus investment, I think your best line of approach would actually be to take a leaf out of the Admiralty's book in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where they would subsidise the construction of certain ships as long as they were built to Admiralty standards and had pre-positioned strong points for the mounting of guns to turn them into armed merchant cruisers. So I would run a similar program where I would sponsor the building of a whole fleet of commercial ships, freighters and such like, but specifically set up to be equipped somewhat like the Cormoran or the Atlantis or the Seeadler or all sorts of other German armed merchant cruiser commerce raider ships, which actually had a remarkable degree of success in both World Wars, but specifically in this case in World War II. So I would basically put my money into those, because then I'd be earning money off of them in before the war if I set the contract up right, and then during the war they're going to be probably the single most effective way of raiding enemy shipping. But other than that, if we're talking about the need to construct a actual sort of warship that we're going to use as a commerce raider, I mean, the M class as prepared for the Z plan isn't actually too bad an idea for a commerce raider. You're talking about sort of something that's armed roughly on the mid-tier of light cruiser weaponry, but very quick. And has a long range, which is pretty much what you need. If you come across a heavy escort, you'd run away, and if you come across a lighter escort, you have the firepower to deal with it. But if I was going to refine that still further, I would basically take a look at the Leander class, because that's kind of the commerce protection cruiser that the British were building at the time. And because the town class had only just about to start construction and they're more fleet cruisers, and I would look at that and go, right, I need to build a light cruiser that can defeat a town class. So I would maybe take kind of the main armament that you find on the Nürnberg class, the 3 triple 5.9-inch turrets, give them a lot more ammunition, a decent secondary battery, and build a larger and more seaworthy hull. So probably something in the 8 to 9,000 ton range. 9 5.9-inch guns, say lots and lots of ammunition, a couple of seaplanes, and a relatively extensive secondary battery, and aim for a minimum 34 knot top speed, but with a good cruising speed as well. So yeah, that would be a decent commerce raider that you would probably mass produce. Brennan Barker asks, why are the Pagoda masts on some Japanese battleships designed to look like they do? Effectively, they are a classic example of what's called feature creep. So during the interwar period, there were an awful lot of new technologies and fighting techniques coming about, and a lot of these required, at least in ideal circumstances, fairly high mountings. And the Pagoda masts evolved as the Japanese looked at all of them and basically went, right, well, we need a space for all of them. So back in the day, in World War One, say, you would have had spotting and maybe a rangefinder for fire control. By the time of the interwar period, you were looking at needing multiple spotting positions because you didn't have as many ships thanks to the Washington Naval Treaty. You also had to worry about anti-aircraft firepower, and one of the best places to have a lot of firing arc is up on a mast clear of the superstructure, back in a period when they thought they thought things like machine guns were still valid anti-aircraft weapons. So you need firing platforms for your machine guns. You've also got to worry about the threat of torpedoes a lot more, so you now need even more spotters. Plus, obviously, with the air threat, even more spotters again, because you're going to have spotters looking for air threats, spotters looking for torpedo tracks, spotters looking for enemy shipping. You've also got more and bigger rangefinders, both for the main battery and in certain cases for the secondary battery, plus fire control directors for your anti-aircraft battery, which is obviously a new thing as well. And then with night fighting being a thing, you need platforms for searchlights. You also need additional mounting points for radio antenna, because radio communications are now a thing. And, well, the list goes on, but those are the main ones. And so as a result, the Japanese went, well, okay, well, we need a spotting platform for this, we need a firing platform for that, we need a directing platform for that. And you eventually end up with something that looks like a pagoda mast. Obviously, the different countries approach this in different ways, with the British approach being gigantic superstructure of doom. BK Zhong asks, what's the worst naval procurement disaster you can think of? Oh, there are so many. Some of them are fairly modern examples that you can probably guess at, but I'd say if it happens in peacetime and you're left with a ship that's practically useless, but you can eventually try and repurpose, it's probably more of a massive naval procurement screw-up than a disaster. A disaster, well, for the sake of narrowing down the options, I'm going to arbitrarily redefine disaster as something that could have had or did have a massive impact on an actual war that broke out shortly thereafter. So in terms of near naval procurement disaster, something that could have been an absolutely terrible, the Iowa class's main turrets, where Bureau of Ordnance and Bureau of Ships managed to end up building a battleship that couldn't actually carry the guns it was designed for because the barbette was too small. They averted that at the very last minute by basically having to create the 16-inch 50 that the Iowa carried from scratch. But that potentially could have had, well, the Japanese Navy was still going to die, but it would have been a rather large embarrassment to have a whole load of extremely large battleship hulls and then not actually having any weapons to put on them. In terms of an actual procurement disaster, probably the one that you can point to that sank the most ships would have been the choice by the British Admiralty to procure the particular type of cordite that they did in the 1900s and 1910s. Admittedly, almost any kind of cordite isn't going to save the battle cruisers at Jutland, but quite a number of ships that either used British cordite because they were British ships or used cordite that was derived from British cordite designs, looking things like the Japanese Navy. Quite a number of ships would just randomly explode in port. HMS Vanguard, the St. Vincent class battleship, the Japanese battleship Mutsu being two prime examples, and the cordite didn't help, certainly, with the battle cruiser and cruiser detonations at Jutland either. So when you look at effectively the kill rate that could be either wholly or partially attributed to that particular type of cordite, I'd say that's probably the single worst naval procurement disaster you could imagine. Now on to the USS Salt Lake City video, and information for this particular video is obviously more of a ship history than anything else, was supplied by the Dictionary of American Naval Fighting Ships, the USS Salt Lake City's own website, and yes, even though it's sunk, it still has its own website. Definitely worth a visit if you can if you have a high tolerance for American flags, shall we say. And, of course, there's a number of articles and sources on the Naval History and Heritage Command website, history.navy.mil, which are quite interesting. Zootron Smith asks, did the British Pacific Fleet deserve the Forgotten Fleet moniker, or did they perform a worthwhile role? So, the British Pacific Fleet did contribute quite usefully to the last stages of the war with Japan, albeit that, despite the fact it was a fairly major size force, when you're in an operational area where you can sail for about 6 hours in any given direction and be fairly sure of encountering an Essex class, they were a little bit overshadowed, shall we say, by the massive size of the US task force that was present at the time as well. But they held up their end of the bargain pretty well. They were very useful distractions for kamikazes during the operations off of Okinawa, with obviously the British armoured carriers being able to shrug off quite a few of those hits, which obviously the attacks themselves in general, as well as the specific ones that got through, might otherwise have gone for US carriers and caused more incidents, such as USS Bunker Hill. The other ships of the fleet, particularly submarines, as well as aircraft and surface ships, are also quite useful in completing the extermination of the Imperial Japanese Navy, taking down a couple of Japanese heavy units in the latter stages of the war. And also, as had been noted whilst HMS Victorious had been operating in the Pacific Ocean a few years earlier, British fighter control was quite good, and with the Supermarine Seafires on board, as well as the Avengers, Corsairs, and Hellcats and such like, the Seafires proved to be very adept at high altitude interception, which was obviously their base model Spitfire's original task. And so the Seafires were incredibly useful, forming part of the Combined Combat Air Patrol, as they were more capable of reaching at high altitudes faster and then fighting better at those high altitudes than the majority of carrier fighters present with the fleet at the time. And to be perfectly honest, at an operational level, the British and American navies got on perfectly well, sharing resources and coverage and etc. between them. Most of the fights over whether or not the British Pacific Fleet should be there and what operations they should take in were mostly fought at the higher levels between the more Anglophobic parts of US Navy High Command, such as Admiral King, and to a degree Halsey as well. Joseph Peterson asks a number of questions about the German High Seas Fleet. What was the reasoning behind German naval design doctrine in the early dreadnought era? Why were they so late to the dreadnought and super dreadnought game? Was the High Seas Fleet really a threat to the Royal Navy? Why did the Royal Navy not attempt to incapacitate the High Seas Fleet with a raid on the Medway-style surprise attack? Was such an attack ever considered? And would the decisive battle doctrine the Japanese eventually employed have made a difference in German designs? So let's answer them all in reverse order, because that's the thing that we do here. Would decisive battle doctrine have made a difference in German designs? Probably. It probably would have made them go for bigger and heavier guns, as opposed to the sort of slightly smaller caliber ones they went for historically, which turned out to be not quite as effective as they thought at battle range. Medway style attack. And was such an attack ever considered? That was actually Royal Navy standing doctrine right up until shortly before the outbreak of the First World War, by a matter of a few years. The main reason they didn't go for it or consider it specifically during the First World War was because by that point minefields and submarines had gotten to a point where it was considered far too dangerous to try and get that close to the German coastline. Even as relatively recently as the mid 1900s, British tactics still called for a close blockade and, if possible, assault on enemy ports. And it was only in that sort of the latter half of the 1900s and into the 1910s that they had to abandon that in favour of a more distant blockade strategy. Was the High Seas Fleet really a threat to the Royal Navy? Yes, it was. If the Royal Navy had basically operated throughout most of the 19th century after the conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars in the knowledge that it only had to bring a small part of its strength to bear anywhere in the world and it could crush anything in its path. The only mild exception to that being the Crimean War, and even then they'd operated 3 or 4 massive separate fleets. Now, with the High Seas Fleet, it was large enough that the Royal Navy couldn't do that anymore, because if they split themselves into several large units and tried to go off and do various different things, they could get overwhelmed in detail by the combined force of the High Seas Fleet. So yeah, it forced the Royal Navy to concentrate all of its modern ships into one single battle fleet and then have a long staring match with the High Seas Fleet across the waters of the North Sea. Obviously, the plenty of spare second line ships could go off and do things like the Gallipoli landings, but yeah, it was definitely a threat, and if the Royal Navy had played its cards wrong and lost a good portion of its battle fleet, that could have quite badly changed the outcome of World War One. And then finally, the reasoning behind their naval design doctrine and why they were so late to the dreadnought and super dreadnought game. Technological limitations, basically. Britain had spent most of the 19th century as the technological leader, and even in the early part of the 20th century, to a large degree, Britain still remained on the forefront of naval technology and design. Obviously, got things like the turbine engine, for example, and that dictated some of everybody else's design doctrine. The Nassau's, for example, being built with vertical triple expansion engines because the Germans couldn't build their own turbines and they didn't fancy paying the British vast amounts of money for the rights to the British turbines. And yeah, that Germany, although sort of as we covered near the beginning of the video, although Germany had a fairly substantial industrial base, the advances in technology that specifically in the naval field were still mostly being made by the British, although other nations were catching up during this period. What's Opera Doc asks, would the US have been better off not conducting the Doolittle raid and instead having Enterprise and Hornet at Coral Sea to support Saratoga and Lexington? Depends how you want to view it, really. In terms of purely objective military strategy, yes, having 4 fleet carriers available instead of 2 would have radically changed the outcome of the Battle of the Coral Sea. We could even have then made Coral Sea effectively the midway of World War II, although with the devastator torpedo bombers still being one of the primary strike components, maybe not, but there you go. Yeah, so objectively speaking, militarily, of course, the 2 extra carriers and their attendant escorts would have made Coral Sea a very different battle. In the overall terms of warfare, the Doolittle raid was a great morale booster, even though militarily it didn't accomplish all that much. But it was a great morale booster. It showed that the US could hit back at the Japanese home territory the same way the Japanese had done so with attacking Pearl Harbor. So, from a propaganda and a morale perspective, the Doolittle raid was probably worth conducting. Whether or not, if you balance up the operational military realities with obviously taking into account the fact that almost as a direct result you'd end up losing Lexington and all of it, the attendant strike power, swings and roundabouts. Me personally, I would have stuck him at Coral Sea, but I can see the political argument for carrying out the Doolittle raid as well. Moscus asks, are you planning to do videos on any Norwegian ships? Also, how's the composition of battle groups changed since the Age of Sail? So, yes, Norwegian ships will be covered when I get to their appropriate point in the list. And as for composition of battle groups changing since the Age of Sail, well, I'm going to exclude the modern era because obviously that's a whole different kettle of fish. But if we're talking about up to the World War II period, obviously carriers weren't a thing during the Age of Sail, so they come in. But in terms of overall battle group composition, an Age of Sail battle fleet was basically made up almost entirely of capital ships. A battle group would have been a mixture of obviously first, second, and third rates, with a few 5th and 6th rate frigates riding as escort, well, not even escorts really, as messengers and scouts to communicate, allow communication between the fleet, to scout for the enemy and to chase down the odd fast prize. That was basically their purpose. Once combat was joined, sort of by gentleman's agreement, the frigates tended to sit out and watch. So the vast majority of ships in an Age of Sail battle group, if you can even call it that, would have been capital ships. Obviously, by the time you get into the era of steam and steel, that kind of stays the same for most of the ironclad era. But as you introduce things like destroyers and cruisers, you end up with a much more layered composition, and obviously all the smaller ships will also fight each other. So by the time you're into the dreadnought era in World War II, you're talking about layers of destroyers, light cruisers and heavy cruisers, and then a few capital ships at the centre. And even if you look at something like Jutland, even with the massive numbers of dreadnought battleships present, the number of cruisers and destroyers still far, far exceeds the number of capital ships present, and they're all mixing it up and scrapping, whilst the capital ships do their living best to pound the living daylights out of each other. So yeah, I'd say that's probably the main change, has been the much greater proportion of smaller ships included in battle group formations, and the fact they're now expected to fight each other out alongside the battleships. And on to the regular questions taken from earlier YouTube videos, much earlier than the ones in that first section. Morbius 3 was taken, says Drachinifel, all things considered, how would the Olympia have fared against the Spanish battleship if that battleship had taken place? So, the battleship in question would have been the Spanish barbette battleship Pelayo. Well, if Olympia had ended up facing off against this thing, it's fairly difficult to say what exactly would have happened. In theory, Pelayo is far more heavily armoured, and it has a reasonable speed. It's also far more heavily armed. So on paper, Olympia doesn't really have much choice but to run away. In practice, there is one major weakness of the ship, which is that its guns, it's not a pre-dreadnought, its guns are in open barbettes, so there is a possibility that whilst Olympia would have a very hard time breaching the Pelayo's actual armoured shell, it could potentially incapacitate its main armament if it got some lucky hits in. With that said, the appalling gunnery of the Spanish ships during the Spanish-American War is not necessarily going to be replicated on Pelayo, because Pelayo was based in Spain, and so in theory might actually have had half-decent gunnery, bearing in mind that American gunnery wasn't particularly all that much during the Spanish-American War either. It's just the Spanish gunnery was almost bad enough as to not even bother. So if Pelayo is suffering from the same appalling gunnery levels as its colonial relatives in the rest of the Spanish Navy, then Olympia has a reasonable chance of winning simply by dint of the fact it's not going to get hit, and it can gradually plaster the ship and wear it down and maybe set it on fire or something. If, however, Pelayo is crewed by a competent crew, then its firepower and armour advantages would be too much for the Olympia to overcome, and I think it would have to withdraw from the combat. Captain Jack Sparrow 10E asks, in your opinion, were the destroyer leader designs of the French, such as Aigle and Mogador, good designs, and how do they compare to designs of other navies of the same era? Well, they're an interesting lot, the contre-torpilleurs, as the French would call them. As far as being good designs, I have to come down on the side of them not being. That's not because on paper you can't make the design work, but more because of how they actually went about doing it. So obviously you have the classic triangle of speed, armor, and protection, and on destroyers you can usually ignore protection, more in favour of just hull design. And unfortunately, the French large destroyers, the contre-torpilleurs, they fall down on two of those three. Aside from one or two examples in certain classes, they generally were a bit too lightly built, which raised problems with them operating at their design speeds. And their firepower, although on paper impressive, was limited by flaws with the guns, the fact that the guns were really a little bit too big, and flaws with the shell supply, which meant that they actually had a rate of fire that would be more comparable with a heavy cruiser than a destroyer. So if you take into account that there were ships, contemporary ships, especially with the last generation like Mogador, you're talking about ships like the Tribals or the Fletchers being vaguely contemporary, and those ships, even though they have a slightly lighter armament, are almost certainly going to win in a gunfight simply because they're going to be spitting out far, far more shells than the French destroyers are. And to be honest, most of these issues with them arise simply from the obsession they had with speed. So, if you can imagine some French version of Jeremy Clarkson standing on the prow of the ship as they try and plough through the water at 40 plus knots, yelling "La puissance!" Go look it up in a translation if you don't know what that meant. Then that was basically seemed to be their obsession with these very large ships. They were by far the fastest destroyers practically to have ever put to sea. But as I say, you're talking about a ship that, by the last designs, was rivaling the displacement of some small World War One leftover light cruisers, but couldn't beat them in a gunfight, and couldn't also beat dedicated gun destroyers in a gunfight, but could outrun them. Assuming it didn't snap in two in a hard turn because its hull was built too lightly. Although, as I said, that hull being built too lightly wasn't necessarily a problem on all of the designs. But generally speaking, they're a bit of a dead end with the way that the French actually built them. If they'd been built by another country, potentially they could have been quite interesting. I think if they'd been prepared to drop 2 or 3 knots for a hull that wasn't made of crepe paper, and maybe as they'd been built in America or Britain, where, well, effectively you would have ended up with something like an even bigger tribal, or an early version of a gearing with sort of twin 5-inch 38s or something like that, at which point, maybe. But yeah, as implemented, no, I don't rate them very well. Zen1701 asks, did anyone think about building a steel ship of the line with or without steam, kind of like HMS Warrior, but with 3 or more decks? Not quite as far as you're imagining, but as you can see here, the French Navy in the ironclad era did kind of try the concept with the Magenta class ironclads, as you can see there, which have double rows of gun ports. And then, much later on, around the 1900s, the rather questionable Drake class of armoured cruiser went for double-stacked casemates for their 6-inch secondary guns all along the sides, which is kind of similar concept and, rather unsurprisingly, didn't really work out very well. A number of dreadnought battleships also went with double-stacked casemate guns, but those were very much the secondaries, whereas opposed on the Drakes, they were kind of main part secondary battery. But anyway, there you go. So yeah, there's kind of examples of iron-steel ships with multiple gun decks. For Super Killer asks, do you think the radar-directed fire control systems on the majority of US Navy ships gave them a definitive edge versus their Axis-allied counterparts? It seems, especially in battleship videos, that a lot of people gloss over or completely forget the radar fire control on large US ships. Definitive edge? I'm going to go with not necessarily, and that's for 3 reasons. First reason being, not all US Navy ships, including battleships, had radar fire control systems that were created equal. For example, at the Battle of Saratoga Strait, 3 of the US battleships there were perfectly capable of landing shots on the incoming Japanese ships at night. The other 3, their radars just weren't up to the task of giving them accurate enough information. So it's not like every US battleship has exactly the same capabilities. Secondly, some of the more often cited figures about the accuracy and ability of US ships to keep their guns on targets come from post-Second World War exercises, which doesn't give an accurate representation of their capabilities during the Second World War. And as I said, because you have those various legacy systems, it also depends on the second factor, which is time. Because radar-directed fire control, yeah, sure, in 1945, radar-directed fire control is present on almost every US capital ship and a lot of smaller ships as well. This gives them a huge advantage compared to how they were in 1941, because the thing is, by 1945, quite a lot of other ships have radar-directed fire control as well. The British have radar-directed fire control on their own ships, coming in round about the same time period as US Navy ships. And in some respects, think radars like the Type 274, certain radars that the British possess are actually better than the US Navy's radars for the majority of the Second World War period, albeit that perhaps you could say that the US Navy's fire control systems, which then take that information and turn it into outputs, are arguably superior in most cases. But in terms of overall radar-directed fire control, say the British had it. There's some indication towards the end of the war that even the Germans had it. There's some speculation. There's some sources that appear to indicate that Tirpitz likely had radar-directed fire control towards the end of its lifespan, for all the good that it did it. The Japanese are basically the only nation that didn't have any kind of significant deployment of radar-directed fire control, or to be honest, actually, for that matter, radar period, on the majority of their fleet during the Second World War. The Italians obviously bowing out in 1943 before it really became major and widespread across almost every other navy. So yeah, it's time period as well. So if you take a US battleship in 1941 at the time of Pearl Harbor, well, no, it's not going to have radar-directed fire control. But sort of that period where you're looking at where many US ships have radar-directed fire control and most of their opponents are unlikely to do so, probably comes around late 42, early 43. There's a bit of a narrow window there. And thirdly, you've also got to take into account engagement, time, and place. So radar-directed fire control gives you an absolute superiority in environments like night fighting, or when the weather's particularly bad, squalls, rain, fog, etc. But on a relatively clear day, by the time you get to World War II, good optical fire control systems are not as good as the later, more advanced radar fire control systems, but they're nearly as good. And if you compare them to some of the earlier radar fire control systems, like the three of the ships that Surigao Strait had, in open water, clear daylight, you probably actually want a really good optical fire control system more than you want a semi-functional radar fire control system. So yeah, it's a nuanced answer, I would say, that yes, the possession of radar-directed fire control systems on most US Navy ships does give them an edge in certain circumstances where the edge applies. It does not apply to all situations, and as I said, exactly how much of an advantage varies on time and who you're comparing them with. And lastly, for this section, Type Here asks, if the Americans had had just one Colorado-class battleship for some reason instead of a North Carolina and a South Dakota at the Battle of Guadalcanal, how would this affect its outcome? Well, it's going to depend on which ship, really, because Colorado and Maryland are theoretically available. West Virginia is not, but by the time West Virginia comes out of dock, it's by far the most capable of the Colorados. But as I say, it's not going to be physically around in the end of 1942 at the time that Kirishima is sunk. So, well, if we put Colorado or Maryland in place of South Dakota, the single biggest change is that you probably don't need a second battleship, to be honest, because, yeah, Kirishima opens fire, same as it did against South Dakota. Let's take Colorado, for instance. Colorado turns its guns to fire on Kirishima and doesn't have a massive electrical failure, at which point it's a close-range knife fight between a battleship armed with 16-inch guns and an overblown battlecruiser armed with 14-inch guns. That fight isn't going to end well for Kirishima at all. Fair enough, Colorado's not quite the same kind of sort of levels of protection as South Dakota, but it's near enough. In some places, it's theoretically better protected at the kind of close range that we're talking about. So, in all likelihood, I think Colorado's going to walk away from this with a really nice kill marking on its hull. And now we're on to the Discord questions. Dr. Dankenstein asks, concerning the Japanese Navy and their planned upgrades to the Yamato class for 6 20-inch guns instead of 3 18s, or 3 triple 18s, I guess, 9 18 guns in total. Do you think this would have been a practical decision, and how do you think an Iowa would fare in a head-to-head slugging match with said upgraded ship? I don't think it's particularly practical. The 20-inch guns don't really offer the Japanese anything, or that they're not getting out of the 18-inch guns, apart from maybe slightly more overkill in terms of penetration. And in exchange for that, you're going to get much lower rate of fire, and you're cutting your number of shells in flight by a third, which therefore is going to decrease your chances of hitting. So, not really a practical decision, in my opinion. How do you think an Iowa or Montana would fare in a head-to-head slugging match with an upgraded ship? Well, at practical battle ranges, an Iowa's already got enough to deal with an 18-inch gun. In fact, actually, as I said, the 20-inch might actually favour the Iowa, because 20-inch gun, yes, it'll hurt more if the shell hits, but there's a one-third less chance of it hitting, which actually works in Iowa's favour. In terms of the Montana's a much more heavily armoured ship, so maybe there's a marginal edge case to say that a 20-inch gun would give a Super-Yamato a little bit more engagement range against a Montana compared to the 18-inch guns. But again, for practical battle ranges, I don't think it makes a spectacular amount of difference. And I say that loss of one-third of your shells is going to hurt you a heck of a lot more than you're going to gain from a slight increase in penetration and damage. Kaiser asks, I know the Sheridan tank with its main gun could fire both shells and rockets. Were there any attempts to do the same with capital ship guns? Well, as regards the Sheridan being able to fire missiles... Oh, hang on a minute. Sorry, wrong Sheridan. That's better. Well, as regards battleships and using a similar kind of system, no. One of the reasons that the Sheridan had this alternate missile launch system was because it was a low-velocity short-barrel gun, as you can probably see there. Naval guns tend to go the opposite direction for very long, and that means the launch charges that naval guns are designed for are going to be much stronger and probably will just crumple a missile up into its component parts and spit them out as a cloud of shrapnel. But even assuming that you can overcome that problem, maybe with some kind of discard encasing, effectively what it comes down to is that during the era when battleship guns were under consideration, missiles, unless you want them to be dumb fired, in which case you might as well use a shell. But if you're using guidance, missiles only really have a range of a few kilometers at best during this period, and the guidance systems, especially considering most of them are still based with the launch vehicle, are even more limited. By the time you get into an era where missiles can travel far enough at this kind of size and can be guided by onboard systems, there aren't any battleships left in service except for the Iowas, and they were considering some form of guided shell for those. But as you can see from the modern debacles that the US Navy has had in that regard, guided shells are a little bit of a difficulty there. So, yeah. That's basically why they didn't do it, is because a naval gun has a far greater range than any kind of gun-launched missile would reasonably have, whilst retaining any of the advantages of being a missile, i.e. the ability to change course and direction towards the target. Zach Akai asks me to shed some light on the general feelings/sentiments from the American and French sides surrounding the naval battle of Casablanca. Well, the root of this is really sort of Vichy French attitudes towards the Allies, and it varied quite considerably, shall we say. I mean, we'll leave the British out of it for the minute, because there's a whole other spectrum of feelings between British and Vichy French troops, largely around to the understandable hostile feelings generated by things like Meuse el Kabir. But if we're looking at the Americans and the French, as I say, it varied dramatically. The higher echelons of Vichy France by sort of 1944 were, weirdly enough, almost in line with the Nazis, but also deeply resented any kind of Nazi interference in their activities in a lot of ways, which is very strange for the French. I mean, the French affair, to be honest, actually, no, I'm not even going to go into those kind of politics. Forget that. Never mind. Anyway, back to Vichy French. Vichy French troops, I say, there was actually quite a remarkable variation. There were some who didn't particularly want to fight the Allies and would quite happily just say, "Yep, okay, we're on your side now," relatively easily. There were a good number who saw their duty to fight for France against anyone who was attacking them, and if that meant that France had changed sides and instead of having the British and Americans on their side, they were now fighting them, then that was fine because they were fighting for France. They weren't fighting for America or the UK. And there were a few who, as I said, kind of followed their political masters at the time and were pretty hardcore supporters of the whole sort of fascist regime in Europe and were perfectly happy to fight the Americans and the British, and probably largely regretted the fact they couldn't go and fight the Russians, although obviously those in SS Charlemagne did. So yeah, mixed bag, but generally speaking, the majority of them were fighting out of a sense of duty, and once they were defeated, they weren't that much of a problem. Rolf, son of Rolf, asks, were marine detachments on naval vessels common during the World Wars? Yes, they were, especially on the larger ships. Now, by the time you get to the age of steam and steel, they are mostly integrated into the ship's crew generally, as opposed to kind of a almost standalone force. In US Navy and Royal Navy ships, which Rolf particularly asks about, they very often would end up manning one or possibly more of the turrets on the ship, using their branches of artillery specialization. So yeah, they were generally more incorporated into the ship's crew in those kind of roles by the time period of the two world wars, but they still did retain, especially in the First World War, a kind of armed ship security and shore party role. Less so in the Second World War, more so in the First World War, but they still did have it, and the marine detachments on board would often be either the go-to leaders or primary elements of the ship security force on most ships, although I'd say with decreasing role in the Second World War, where the Marines tended to, ironically enough, in both navies take up their more traditional role of amphibious infantry. Krager asks, what specifically about the Nelson class's hoist system resulted in such a low rate of fire compared to other nations' 16-inch battleships? There were two parts to the issues with the shell hoist system in the Nelsons. Part of it was that because the ships were basically a combination of the N3 and G3 designs crammed into a 35,000-ton hull, weight savings had been made everywhere, and one of these was the turrets being quite small, and that meant that unlike a lot of conventional battleships where the shells would be hoisted straight out of the magazines, laying horizontal, because of the size of the Nelson's turrets, the shells had to be brought horizontal out of the magazine, switched up to vertical, hauled up vertically into the turret, then laid down horizontally again for loading, which took additional time. And secondly, after the lessons learned from Jutland, which obviously most of which were contained in the Secret Admiralty report rather than the thin armour meme that was distributed around more publicly, should we say the Nelson system of flash safety interlocks was a little bit overly paranoid? They went from battle cruisers which removed all the safety interlocks to a battleship where effectively any space the shell travelled more than its own length, you could guarantee there'd be some kind of safety interlock or flash door. Over time, during the interwar period, they gradually rationalised this to a more sensible level, and as a result, as I mentioned in a previous video, Rodney, in its engagement with Bismarck, was able to maintain a respectable level of fire rather than the rather incredibly slow rate that was initially outputted by the class in the early 1920s. Krager also asks, what was the Royal Navy's view on the suddenly enlarged US Navy full of steamships and monitors after the American Civil War? The British, and the Royal Navy in particular, were actually more concerned about the steamships than the monitors. I mean, they were very gratified to see Congress almost immediately cut the legs out from under the US Navy as soon as the American Civil War was concluded. And actually, if you look at the debates, actually even before it was technically over, which resulted in the US Navy going from being a very large navy to a very small one very quickly. But in overall terms, as I say, the Royal Navy was actually more worried about the steamships. The monitors, they were fairly confident that they could handle them with their own ironclads, which were considerably larger and had a lot more firepower. And they had their own sort of monitors for close-in work, coastal work and such, being either built, having already been built, or under development. And they were aware of the technological limitations with regards to the US's manufacture of armor and shells. So the advent of the monitors meant that sort of a close-in blockade of the US ports, if it had become necessary for whatever reason, would have been more difficult. But the Royal Navy's sort of hierarchy of likely events didn't really include close blockade of the US coastline in the late 1800s in the first, second, or even third pages of likely events we have to plan for, so they weren't too worried about that. As I say, they were more worried about the steam frigates and such that the US Navy possessed, because large steam frigates were excellent commerce raiders, and the prospect of somebody going commerce raiding against the rather widespread British merchant marine was far more of a concern to the British in that time period than anybody actually trying to launch into a stand-up fight with them, because they were pretty confident they could beat anybody or any 2 or 3 bodies in a stand-up fight of a fleet. But since the British Empire depended on peaceful transit of merchant marine, that's the side of the US Navy they were a lot more worried about and took a lot more precautions against. And finally, Krager asks, do actual design blueprints still exist for pre-dreadnoughts? It depends largely on the country that you're looking for, because, shall we say, German, Japanese, and to a certain extent Italian records did suffer from rather annoying cases of fire, courtesy of the Royal and US Air Forces. So some of those records are lost, and other records, things like the Austro-Hungarian pre-dreadnoughts and the Russian pre-dreadnoughts, you can find them if you know where to look in real life, as it were, but they're not generally widely published on the internet because there's not been not as much interest in them as there has been in dreadnought battleships, and as a result most of those blueprints still remain in archives, and to a certain extent that's even true of a lot of US and British pre-dreadnoughts, and French pre-dreadnoughts for that matter. Actually, there are a few blueprints available of pre-dreadnoughts online, but by and large, if you want to have a look at those, best thing to do would be to contact, in the UK, the National Maritime Museum. In the US, probably still the US Navy, maybe the Library of Congress, or respective National Archive type institutions in the country in question. Snoo Snoo asks, what advantages did super heavy shells have over high velocity guns and vice versa, which would be an overall more effective gun type? So the idea of a high velocity gun is simple. You make the shell travel faster, that gives it more kinetic energy. That means for a given shell it can punch through more armor. It has the added additional advantage of making the shell flight profile a lot flatter, which means it's more likely to strike at an angle that is closer to normal as opposed to a steep angle that might help the armor deflect it. So high velocity guns are very good for short to medium ranges, assuming you're using a standard shell and increasing the charge rather than making the shell lighter. Whereas if you make the shell lighter to get your high velocity, you have the problem of the shell losing speed very rapidly, and actually then becomes fairly ineffective outside of a very short range. This is one of the problems with a lot of German 11-inch shells in the First World War. When you're talking about super heavy shells, a super heavy shell is designed, one, to carry out its momentum a lot further, so obviating velocity loss, albeit obviously being a heavy shell, it's going to have less velocity to start with for the same charge, so you generally need to find a fairly large charge and or a fairly long barrel gun to get it up to a usable velocity, so you're not just recreating a mortar, hence the use of super heavy shells in something like the 16-inch 50 gun on the Iowa class. And the other idea of the super heavy shell is it's more of a long range firing shell, designed for long distance combat. So the idea is that because it is heavier and therefore will drop faster quicker, you need to fire it at a greater angle, which means it will then come down at a greater angle, firing it in a lot higher above a ballistic arc. And this means that whilst its angle against the armor belt actually gets significantly worse for penetration a lot faster than a normal shell would, it in theory arrives with more kinetic energy, but B, it also arrives at a better angle for penetrating deck armor, which is what you're more likely to hit at longer ranges. So all things considered, if you're firing the same gun with the same charge, a super heavy shell is a better choice for long range engagements, with the one caveat that because of their longer flight time, they're easier to dodge, whereas a higher velocity shell is better at short to medium range engagements. So, for me personally, on paper, the super heavy shell looks all fine and dandy. However, the kind of long range engagements that these shells are designed to exploit, at least at battleship scale, never really happen. No one ever feels confident enough to open fire at those kind of ranges. No one really has the accuracy to do so, and almost every battleship engagement involves both sides, or at least the side with the speed advantage, trying to close the range to improve accuracy and penetration. So to be perfectly honest, I actually think the higher velocity gun is the better option, with the caveat that you're making the gun high velocity and therefore firing a decently weighted shell. Let's say making a shell lighter to make it go faster compared to average is not a good design route to go down. And finally, for this week, Snoo also asks, why doesn't the US use monitors for cheap coastal bombardment, since a couple of 16-inch guns hurling shells at the enemy sounds far cheaper than using million-dollar missiles on targets near the shore, especially when one has air superiority? Theoretically, yes, that would be a valid point. However, even the mighty US Navy has funding limits, and a monitor armed with, I don't know, to take a turret off an Iowa class or something, would run the problem of the bombardment itself will cost less, but you're having to build, operate, and maintain an entire niche ship that can pretty much only do that, unless you put it on some kind of much larger multi-mission ship, at which point you're not going to risk that in a close shore bombardment many times soon. You're probably going to be wanting to use it for other missions, and for those other missions, it's basically dragging around several thousand tons of useless steel, so it's less efficient. So yeah, the actual operating costs of running a monitor fleet these days, given the relatively small operational parameters it's going to have, are cost prohibitive, effectively. And then there's the advantage. Yes, the missiles do cost a lot more, but these days, especially with the VLS systems on the Arleigh Burkes and other US Navy warships, the full strike length ones, they can use them for multiple different things. So you might use that missile tube for a surface-to-air missile, a surface-to-surface missile, maybe even an anti-submarine missile if they get a successor to Asarock into the system, or a long-range bombardment cruise missile. And you can attack a lot more with a cruise missile, obviously targets inshore and such like. And to be perfectly honest, these days, if you've got air superiority already and you haven't already bombed everything flat near the coastline, there's not that many things these days that are built heavily enough to withstand a regular Arleigh Burke destroyer's deck guns any more than they would withstand a 16-inch shell. And if there is a target that would merit a 16-inch shell that a 5-inch shell may not necessarily scratch, well, if you've got air superiority, you might as well just drop a bomb on it. That's what they're there for, after all. And that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Drydock. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again in another video.